You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, DNA ID, Malice, All Things Crime, and Riddle Me That. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking. 25-year-old Donna Lass was working as a nurse at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel-Casino in State Line, Nevada on September 6, 1970. She was nearing the end of her shift when at approximately 1:45 a.m. she disappeared from her workstation and was never seen again. In the hours that followed, it's been claimed that somebody called her hotel employers and the landlord of her Monte Verde apartment at 3893 Pioneer Trail Road, reporting that Donna had been called out of town due to a family emergency or an illness. Having walked to the Sahara Tahoe Hotel that evening from a previous residence, her 1968 Chevy Camaro was found as expected in the parking lot of her apartment. Inside her apartment, everything seemed in order. There were no signs of a struggle, and her bank account showed no unusual activity. Harvey Hines, a former Groveland detective, interviewed many years later by the Tahoe Daily Tribune, stated, quote, "There was a lot of evidence inside Sahara Tahoe Casino that she left directly from there. She was a very personal person, and she left a lot of personal items behind. An open letter, a dirty uniform, and on her log, a pen was dragged from the last word she wrote to the bottom of the page." The last person apparently to see Donna Lass before she disappeared was Joan Bentley from San Francisco, who stated that Donna appeared in good spirits at approximately 1:40 a.m. The last entry on her log, according to Mary Pilker, Donna's sister, were the words, "Patient complains of." That's the part where the pen trails off the page. It's safe to conclude, based on all the evidence, that Donna Lass disappeared from her place of work, possibly lured to a claimed patient emergency in the parking lot of the Sahara Tahoe Hotel, where she was then abducted by one or more persons. With no sightings or contact from Donna Lass in the last 51 years, the likelihood is that the young nurse met her death in the hours or days after her disappearance. We know that Donna Lass had walked to work that evening from a previous residence, so her car had obviously never been parked outside the casino that day. If the perpetrator knew Donna Lass and the vehicle she drove, then a phone call to the Sahara Hotel and Casino, implying she had been called out of town for a family emergency and would be away from work for some time, would have been a wasted call had her Chevy Camaro convertible been spotted sitting idle in the parking lot of the casino for any extended period. This may imply that the telephone caller knew her movements prior to work the previous day, and would also indicate that the perpetrator knew her vehicle was parked outside the apartments, where it was less likely to draw attention. Yet this caller still needed to give reasons for her soon-to-be absence from work by calling the hotel, while at the same time allaying any worries the landlord may have concerning rent collection. The relatives of Donna Lass lived in South Dakota, just over 1,400 miles away, so any phone call stating Donna had been called away on family business could easily have been designed to buy the abductor or abductors time. Perhaps time to dispose of Donna's body and cover their tracks, or to complete whatever evil plans they had, if the young nurse was still alive. If the person or persons responsible for her abduction were aware of where her family lived, this telephone call wouldn't have worked, leading to the possibility that the caller had prior and personal knowledge regarding the life of Donna Lass, and wasn't a stranger.
The timing of her disappearance from the Sahara Tahoe Hotel is also very interesting, thought to be approximately 1:45 a.m. It is close enough to the end of her shift, having changed from her nurse's uniform into regular clothes, for her disappearance not to be overtly suspicious, yet the person or persons responsible for her abduction didn't wait for her to leave the Sahara Tahoe Hotel by her own volition. They struck at a crucial period, just before her shift ended. Donna Lass had made plans to meet up with her friend from San Francisco, Joanne Gertsch, who had made the long journey from the Bay Area for the Labor Day weekend, both intending to travel back to the Monte Verde apartments in Joanne's vehicle once Donna Lass's shift at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino had finished. Was the person or persons responsible for her abduction aware of her plans to meet a friend, and hence why they struck approximately 15 minutes prior to her shift ending, while the opportunity still existed? Again, does this show an intimate knowledge of Donna Lass's life and work schedule, and imply those responsible were closer than we may want to believe? In the months after the abduction of Donna Lass, heavy snow in the region would hamper the search efforts by police. 7 months later, dramatic developments would arise in the search for Donna Lass, when a March the 22nd, 1971 postcard arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle containing what appeared to be directions, with indications it had been mailed by the Bay Area murderer. A newspaper article stated that, quote, "The site depicted on the Pines card was from an advertisement published last Sunday by several newspapers. It was an artist's rendition of houses among trees at a Boise Cascade Company project at Incline Village, where construction had just begun on the development. While much of the Sierra area is under several feet of snow, Incline Village has only 2 feet on the ground." Police went to the area to determine if a search was possible. Chief Lauritzen added, "There's no point to a search at this time. It's unlikely a victim would be uncovered before spring." The card was likely crafted by the Zodiac Killer sometime between March the 19th, 1971 and March the 21st, 1971, because the postcard featured a Forest Pines advertisement from the March the 19th, 1971 San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. The postcard contained the usual Zodiac crosshairs, but had 5 pasted phrases glued over the advertisement. The 5 phrases were: 1. Sierra Club. 2. Sought Victim 12. 3. Peek Through the Pines. 4. Pass Lake Tahoe areas. And finally, 5. Around in the snow, with the final phrase of "around in the snow" pasted upside down, giving an ominous foreboding to the whereabouts of Donna Lass. In the top right corner, the Zodiac Killer had punched a hole in the card.
The phrases on the postcard could be giving us directions to the burial site of Donna Lass, but in absence of the communication mentioning anything about who the victim was, it could be a postcard created to identify the name of Donna Lass, rather than where her remains could be found. The Pines postcard contained eerily similar phraseology to the posted wording on the Monticello card, soon to be mailed on July 13, 1971. In fact, the Monticello card mimicked the Pines card in the directional nature of the communication. That card contained the phrases, "in the woods" and "near Monticello," whereas the Pines card stated "past Lake Tahoe areas" and "Sierra Club." The Monticello card may have been identifying the victim as Kathy Billick, 18 years old. She was murdered in the Via Montalvo woods of Saratoga on April 11, 1971. So why should the similarly constructed Pines card be any different? If we use the directional instructions on the Pines card in the same way as the Zodiac Killer's payphone calls from Vallejo and Napa, then we must logically conclude they are directions aimed at the local police department. This makes perfect sense when we consider that the South Lake Tahoe Police Department's home on March 22, 1971 was located at Fremont Avenue and Mono Way on the south tip of Lake Tahoe, thereby making the instructions of, quote, "past Lake Tahoe areas" It makes perfect sense. When you pass Lake Tahoe on its west side, you'll find Clear Tappan Lodge, a private club for Sierra Club members only. The lodge opened on Christmas Eve 1934, according to lodge old-timer Frank Shoemaker. Clear Tappan Lodge is the Sierra Club's largest and most popular lodge, known among its many supporters as the Sierra Club's flagship lodge. It's situated on Donner Pass Road, shrouded in pine trees. If you, quote, peek through the pines from the roadside edge, you can see the Sierra Club in the distance. If you place the Sierra Club phrase on the postcard over the Clear Tappan Lodge on a map, the punched holes on the right side of the postcard falls over the Donner Memorial State Park. This will be extremely important when we feature the Monticello card mailed 4 months later. It too identifies the memorial site of another possible claimed Zodiac victim, that being 15-year-old Kathy Snoozy, who is the phonetic namesake of Kathy Billick, and she's buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park in San Jose. The Zodiac is seemingly blinding the word memorial to the names of Kathy and Donna, using a word game through the two pasted postcards. 4 years later, on December 27, 1974, a Christmas card was mailed to the sister of Donna Lass in South Dakota, depicting some pine trees covered in snow and stating, "Happy greetings and best wishes for a Happy New Year." It was followed by a handwritten message that read, "Best wishes, St. Donna and Guardian of the Pines." If you drop down the roadside on Google Maps alongside the Sierra Club of Clear Tappan Lodge, you'll notice that uncanny resemblance to the picture on the Donna Lass Christmas card mailed to Mary Pilker. Clear Tappan Lodge opened on the Christmas Eve of 1934, creating yet another coincidence.
The assertion that the Pines card was a hoaxer because he was claiming 12 victims at this juncture is a flawed argument. The author of the Pines card was not claiming 12 victims at all, only that they had sought victim 12 at some point. The word sought is the past participle of seek, insinuating that the author had once sought Donna Lass as victim number 12. All this phrase proved was that the Zodiac Killer, if the author, had read the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper article by Paul Avery on September the 26th, 1970, entitled "Nurse Vanishes, a Tahoe Mystery." Everything required to design the Pines card was available in this newspaper article, including not only where she had previously worked at the Letterman General Hospital in Presidio Park, but the month she started work at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel in Nevada. The Zodiac Killer, by stating he had sought Donna Lass as victim number 12 while she worked in the Presidio Park, from his perspective, lends credence to his claims in the abduction of Donna Lass, because the Zodiac Killer was last seen entering this park a matter of minutes after the murder of Paul Stein on October the 11th, 1969. The Zodiac Killer had claimed 10 victims on April the 20th, 1970, in the My Name Is letter. He had claimed 12 victims by June the 26th, 1970, in the Button letter. So it wasn't particularly a difficult calculation to work out that he would have been seeking Donna Lass as either victim number 11 or 12 between these dates, because she began work at the beginning of June at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel. So by pasting sought victim 12 on the Pines card, the Zodiac Killer was attempting to bind his attacks in the Bay Area to the abduction and likely murder of Donna Lass in South Lake Tahoe. By incorporating the phrase sought victim 12 into the Pines card, he is effectively bridging the gap between the murder of the taxicab driver Paul Stein and the disappearance of Donna Lass, both of whom are indelibly connected to the Presidio Heights district of San Francisco. This phrase wasn't a mistake. It was deliberately fashioned to plant a seed in the mind of investigators. Whether this subtlety was lost in reading is wholly dependent on the observer.
Mailed 51 days after the disappearance of Donna Lass, and 5 months before the Pines card, the Halloween card was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle on October 27, 1970, and addressed to Chronicle reporter Paul Avery. with his surname misspelled as Averly. The front face of the card contained a skeleton with the number 14 written on its hand, with the pre-written message of, quote, "I feel it in my bones. You ache to know my name, and so I'll clue you in." Once the card was opened, it revealed a second skeleton pasted into position by the Zodiac. He had also added a pumpkin to the groin of the skeleton on the card outer, along with 12 eyes to the card inner. The wording of "Peekaboo, you are doomed," 14, and the exclamation of "Boo" were handwritten by Zodiac on the card inner, accompanied by an unusual symbol, the letter Z, and his familiar crosshairs. The strange symbol also took pride of place on the upper left corner of the envelope, usually reserved for the return address of the sender. The phrase of "sorry, no cipher" was written twice, and shaped like a letter X on the envelope inner. On the back of the card, the Zodiac had written the two words of "paradise" and "slaves" in a cross formation, with the four phrases of "by fire," "by gun," "by rope," and "by knife," each occupying the four quadrants formed by the cross. Despite the claims of "sorry, no cipher" by the Zodiac, this is still an extremely cryptic communication that has confounded and confused in equal measure over the last 50 years. Some people believe that the card was a direct threat to the life of Paul Avery, that he was to become the 14th victim, while others simply believe the Zodiac was updating his running victim total to 14. On December 30th, 2013, Tahoe 27, a contributor to my forum ZodiacKillersite.com, began a thread that would change our way of approaching the Halloween card, when she forged a link between "by fire," "by gun," "by rope," and "by knife," written on the back of the October 27, 1970 communication. She connected it to a Tim Holt comic book from 1952. The front cover of the comic book featured a cowboy called Red Mask, whose fate lay in the balance, seated at the foot of a death wheel carrying the same four methods of death as listed in Zodiac's Halloween card. The Wheel of Misfortune in this comic book is based upon the Road of Fortune, a symbol of the capricious nature of fate, which belongs to the goddess Fortune, who spins it at random. Some of the people summoned to the wheel suffer great misfortune, while others can experience great windfalls. Most, but not all people in the Zodiac community have accepted this as part inspiration for the design of the Halloween card, suggesting that the Zodiac may have had a childhood interest in comics that permeated into his later years. The same could be true regarding his willingness to use ciphers and codes in his communications, bearing in mind that the Dick Tracy Magic Decoder was an integral part of the American advertisements in the 1950s, encouraging children to eat their breakfast cereals, while also capturing their interest in rudimentary code breaking. These were a regular feature on Post Sugar Crisp, Raisin Bran, and Sugar Rice Crinkles, providing a daily diet of code breaking that undoubtedly captured the impressionable minds of many children growing up in a mid-20th century post-war America. However, that doesn't mean a young Zodiac killer was necessarily a child in the 1950s.
3 months after the mailing of the Halloween card, the movie Vanishing Point, previewed in January of 1971, featuring a disaffected ex-policeman called Kowalski, being pursued across California by police in his 1970 Dodge Challenger, culminating in his death when he drives into two bulldozers forming a roadblock. The movie's January trailer featured the commentary of, quote, "They want to get him and put him away, but they'll have to catch him first." Later in the trailer, the KOW radio host reporting on the police pursuit stated, "And there goes the Challenger being chased by the blue meanies on wheels." A month and a half later, the Zodiac Killer mailed another letter, this time to the Los Angeles Times. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. Like I have always said, I am crack-proof. If the blue meanies are ever going to catch me, they had better get off their fat asses and do something. Because the longer they fiddle and fart around, the more slaves I will collect for my afterlife. I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. The reason I'm writing to the Times is this: they don't bury me on the back pages like some of the others. The wording in the communication stated, "If the blue meanies are ever going to catch me, they had better get off their fat asses," which is extremely noteworthy when we consider the Vanishing Point trailer, which carried the phrases of, "But they'll have to catch him first," and "There goes the Challenger being chased by the blue meanies." If that doesn't convince you that the Zodiac Killer drew inspiration from this film, then consider the following. The Vanishing Point movie went on general release in America on March the 13th, 1971, the postmark date on the envelope mailed to the Los Angeles Times. The most important feature of this letter was the suggestion of his involvement in the October the 30th, 1966 brutal murder of Sherry Jo Bates alongside the Riverside City College Library. This case and its accompanying communications will be discussed in much greater detail in a future podcast or two. The Zodiac Killer Pines card would arrive 9 days after the Los Angeles Times letter on March the 22nd, 1971, regarding the disappearance of Donna Lass from the south side of Lake Tahoe that may have featured the Sierra Club of Claire Tappan Lodge. Strangely, despite the final scene of the Vanishing Point movie being filmed in Cisco, Utah, the death of lead character Kowalski was portrayed as being in Cisco, California, just 11.7 miles west of Claire Tappan Lodge in Placer County. In another strange coincidence, the officer overseeing the conclusion to Kowalski's death after he ran his 1970 Dodge Challenger into the roadblock of bulldozers was the character Deputy Collins, played by Robert Donner. The address of Claire Tappan Lodge is Donner Pass Road. 20 days after the mailing of the Halloween card, an exclusive report on November the 16th, 1970, was published by Paul Avery, titled New Evidence in Zodiac Killings, linking the Zodiac Killer to the Riverside murder of Sherry Jo Bates and accompanying communications. A connection to Riverside and the Halloween card was suggested by Phil Sins to Paul Avery. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so Phil Sins was a man that lived down in the Riverside area down in Southern California, and he had been following the Sherry Jo Bates case for some time, and when he saw that Zodiac was making, national news, and certainly in Southern California, starting to travel down there, he started reading about Zodiac and saying, this sounds just like this author that wrote these letters in the Bates case. And he, of course, went to the local police in Riverside, and they sort of dismissed him. But what a lot of people don't know is that Riverside actually reached out to Napa County Sheriff's Department after the Lake Berryessa attack by Zodiac. And they said, your crime has some similarity to our crime down here, this 1966 murder of Sherry Bates. And it may have been because Phil Sins was in their ear saying, hey, you need to look into this. And nothing really came from it at the time. I don't think Napa thought that it was related to their case. Besides a stabbing, that's the only thing that really links it. But Phil Sins stuck with it, and he was determined to prove that, hey, there's something here. I think this person in the Bates case is connected to Zodiac. So he reached out to Paul Avery after reading about the threat on Paul Avery from Zodiac. And Paul Avery supposedly went down to visit him. That's one thing that's been mentioned. Now, I interviewed Phil Sins. It's been, I don't even know how long it's been, maybe 10 years ago now. And we talked, and he shared his recollections of what happened. He didn't remember meeting Paul Avery in person. He thought he had sent letters to Paul, and that's how they communicated. But anyhow, in the book, I think it was reported that he went there in person and met with Phil Sins. And that's really where the Sherry Jo Bates case kicks in, where Riverside activity kicks in, and I can't wait in a future episode to really dive in and tackle that. But that's sort of where that comes from, and the whole introduction to Riverside in the Zodiac case comes in.
The first contact was on October the 20th, 1969, with Thomas Kinkead and Napa County Sheriff Earl Randall. This was a year earlier, before Phil Sins even contacted Paul Avery. So do you think Phil Sins' suspicions were arisen solely on the Halloween card?
Well, I think he was suspicious all along. Once the Zodiac news made its way down to California, or Southern California, I should say, and he started reading about what Zodiac was writing and what he was saying and the threats he was making, I think that's when it really kicked in that it might be the same person. But it wasn't until the Avery article came out that was published all over California about the threatening Halloween card. That's when he said, I need to take this step and reach out to Paul Avery directly.
I've looked at the Halloween card, and I can understand why people may make a connection from that to Riverside because of the Halloween connection. But I don't think there's a link from the Halloween card to the Riverside murder. If we look at the Halloween card, the Zodiac killer went out of his way in adding a second skeleton to that card, the implication being that he was suggesting two victims. The inspiration for this card may be found in the October the 12th Chronicle article entitled Gilbert and Sullivan Clue to Zodiac, hence the card stating I'll clue you in. Now, in the article, it mentions teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen with the word teenagers hyphenated. In the Halloween card, he gives us a head count over the second skeleton, writing 4-teen, thereby implying 4 teenagers in his running total of 14. Now, the Zodiac killer was only claiming 4 teenagers in his victim count by October the 27th, 1970. That was Faraday, Jensen, Snoozy and Furlong. I think these 2 skeletons were depicting the murders of Kathy Snoozy and Deborah Furlong, which the October the 12th article made no mention of. So, what, Mike, are your thoughts on the composition of this communication and the strange symbol on the envelope and card inner?
I've been struggling recently with what Zodiac was trying to tell us. Obviously, with his symbolism, they're clues, however subtle, about who he is or something he wants the police to figure out, whatever it is. He's sending some kind of message. Unfortunately, it hasn't been discovered about what that message is. For a long time, a lot of people have assumed that 14 was a possible victim count. Recently, due to work I'm doing on a suspect that I have who was born on February 14th, that 14 has new meaning to me. It might be a way of taunting the police, saying, hey, I was born on the 14th, it's my birthday, that kind of thing. And again, police haven't been able to figure out too much of what Zodiac was trying to clue them into. So I think it's open to interpretation, but no doubt that Zodiac could have been, trying to pad his victim count and trying to take credit for other crimes, whether he was connected to them or not.
You don't think the card was a threat on Paul Avery?
Oh, I have no doubt that he was trying to make Avery nervous and scared, and it worked. He basically went out and he's going to firing ranges and wearing pins that say I'm not Paul Avery, as is everyone else, and I think everyone got a good laugh out of it. But I think he was legitimately scared. You've got a proven killer sending him a threatening card like that. I think anyone would be afraid. So I think definitely the intent was to scare Paul Avery. And I'm sure the fact that Avery had labeled him a latent homosexual in one of his articles probably didn't help with Zodiac warming up to him.
There is a complete separation up to the Stein murder, where the Zodiac killer went out of his way to connect himself to each of the 4 canonical attacks. Then subsequent to the Stein murder, he would use vague references of killing a man in a parked car, referring to Officer Richard Raditich, giving an interesting ride to a woman and her baby in the Kathleen Johns abduction, referring cryptically to being involved in the disappearance of Donna Lass at South Lake Tahoe, and then finally the Riverside activity regarding Sherry Jo Bates. Do you think this vagueness by the Zodiac killer is effectively an admission that he wasn't responsible for any of these later crimes or Sherry Jo Bates, and he was just allowing himself a get-out clause had any of these crimes been undeniably solved?
Yeah, I think the Bates one we don't know about. The Bates is way before he started Zodiac, as far as we know, although there's some clues in that writing that seem to point to, a Z word or something surrounding Zodiac. But if you just take the Bates Riverside stuff out of it and you just focus on the Bay Area crimes, it definitely seems as if he's very specific, giving details. Lake Herman Road, the girl was facing this direction. In Blue Rock Springs, the boy was also shot in the knee. Different things like that. He's giving very specific accounts. One thing he was vague on, and I think some people out there believe that it was a copycat. I don't. I think it was 100% Zodiac, was the Lake Berryessa attack. He did not really provide a lot of details about that attack for whatever reason. Maybe it's because he thought they could identify him and he didn't want to put too much out. I don't know. But some of those other crimes that he mentioned are very, very lacking in details. And personally, I believe that's because he had nothing to do with those other crimes.
And do you believe none of those crimes were the Zodiac? Do you think Raditich, Donna Lass, or Robert Salem, any of those, have any chance of being the Zodiac killer?
It could be. It seems like you could walk up to a random person sitting in a car, whether it's a cop or not, shoot them and just take off. It could technically be him, but he's so vague on the details that he's almost just trying to sell the idea. Although the last one in particular, it seems like he really, assuming that all the mailings surrounding her case, if they're really from him, he really made a point to hammer that home and spent a lot of time with that. We've got multiple mailings in the last one versus some of the other cases, Raditich, Salem. You're not getting mailings from someone claiming to be Zodiac on those. So I think he has, if any of those could be legit, it would be the last case, because he's really hammering home and providing more detail and sending multiple mailings. One interesting thing is that Donna Lass had a cousin named Wayne Lass who lived in Vallejo. And coincidentally, he was married to a woman named Donna, a different Donna, not his cousin. But just the fact that there's a Vallejo connection there of any kind for Donna Lass makes it at least interesting, because you have to wonder, could Zodiac have been friends with the Lass family or Wayne Lass, Donna's cousin? For me, I look at that as a possibility, and then Zodiac, whoever he is, could have had some kind of tie to Donna Lass that we just don't know about. Or perhaps that's why he had the specific interest in her. Maybe he hadn't abducted and killed her, but since he knew of her, it was a special interest to him, and that's why he went out of his way to spend a lot of time on her case.
So in terms of Donna Lass, do you think the timing of her abduction close to the end of her shift, the apparent knowledge by her killer that her vehicle wasn't sitting outside the Sahara Tahoe Hotel, and the fact her family lived 1,400 miles away, thereby the phone call serving as a purpose of buying time, is suggestive of a perpetrator or perpetrators that had intimate knowledge of the young nurse's life, somebody that knew her?
I sort of go back and forth on that. I think that a random stranger that just abducted her and took her to wherever location and did whatever he did to her, I don't think he would need to make any phone calls. I think that he would just discard her and move on and not link himself to the case, because by reaching out, calling someone, you're inserting yourself where you don't need to be inserted if you're a stranger. So to me, it indicates that the person may have known her, wanted to spend time with her, wanted to have time alone. It's possible, we just don't know, that she somehow made it back to her home that night and wasn't abducted near her work, and the encounter happened at her home, or someone gave her a ride home that we just don't know about, and that call was at that point to buy time so he could have time with her. That's just one of the puzzling pieces of the case. A lot of people just assume she walked out of work and was abducted right there. We don't know whether she had arranged a ride with someone. People point out that her logbook had like a trailing off writing, like she was abducted as she was writing in her logbook at work. But to believe that, we'd have to believe that someone kidnapped her and dragged her all the way out of a casino where there's bound to be lots of witnesses. So I tend to think that's a red herring, that writing. But we just don't know what happened once she got up the door of the casino.
There were reports that a friend came up from San Francisco, Joanne Gertsch, from San Francisco, somebody she knew from the Bay Area. Have you heard the same thing?
I had heard that, and I don't know that she, Joanne has publicly talked about it. Maybe it would be worth us trying to reach out to her just to try and figure out what's accurate there, if she's still alive. I don't know if she's even alive at this point, but we're willing to talk. But I think the only person that could really answer that is her, unless it's in the police reports, and there haven't been too many reports released about Donna's case.
In the introduction, it was explained how the Zodiac may have sought victim 12 in San Francisco. The April the 20th letter claimed 10 victims, but the Dragon card on April the 28th, 1970 didn't up this total. Donna Lass took her employment to the Sahara Tahoe Hotel on June the 6th, 1970. So the Zodiac killer would have effectively sought Donna Lass primarily in the month of May 1970 had he sought victim 12. A short window of time. So it might be a good idea if we could track down this friend to see if anybody was stalking or harassing her at the time of May 1970 in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and I would hope and I would think that the police back then questioned her friends and said, hey, was there anyone she was having problems with? Was there anyone that she was worried about that may have been harassing her? Hopefully that was done. We just don't know the full extent of what was done because we don't have access to a lot of stuff. But that would be my first line of questioning if I'm a detective investigating the case. And friends, a lot of, I think women especially have a good bond with their friends, and they share secrets and they open up to them about things they won't talk with other people, their family maybe. So I think Donna's friends could really provide some insights into what was going on in Donna's life at the time she vanished.
Right, we'll jump forward to 1973, and this is something that you posted on your forum. You pointed out this fact anyway. So the author of the Albany Times Union letter in 1973 placed crosshairs on the return address section of the envelope. The only other time the Zodiac killer added crosshairs to the upper left side of an envelope was the Paul Stein letter on October the 13th, 1969. I have no doubt the Albany letter is genuine Zodiac correspondence based on the crosshairs and the comparison between the Albany letter and the 148 character cipher in 1971. What are your thoughts overall on the Albany letter?
Yeah, the Albany letter is something I've always wrestled with because we know that there's Darlene Farron had spent time in Albany, New York with her ex-husband, Jim Crabtree. One of the suspects that's been brought forward, Richard Gaikowski, had spent time in Albany. There's a name in Darlene's phone book, in her personal phone book, a guy named Joe Mahar. And come to find out, he lived in Albany, New York. So we're talking 3,000 miles across the country. So for there to be some connections to victims and suspects and people surrounding the case, 3,000 miles across the country in Albany, and then lo and behold, a possible Zodiac letter is postmarked there. And that letter is not quickly dismissed by the FBI. You know, in their examination of it, they can't quickly rule out Zodiac as being the author, which to me seems interesting and maybe lends some credibility that Zodiac was there. So there may be a connection. The crosshairs, of course, being on two different letters, one that's not the real Zodiac, one that is, could be a coincidence, but I think we have to consider the alternative, that it's not a coincidence and that perhaps Zodiac was there in Albany.
And also we have to consider the note, the typewritten note found in Doreen Gall's belongings, who was murdered on November the 21st, 1969. There's something very curious about this communication. Again, you pointed it out. Looks like drops or beads at the bottom. I mean, it says, so you think you can fool the old killer. Ha ha. I know your movements and the time they are made. Time is short. Enjoy life while you can. You are too beautiful to live, and I must kill you, the Zodiac killer. That looks similar, those beads, to the Fairfield letter on the 16th of December 1969, because you've got those sort of beaded drops like you had from the dripping knife. And also you've got ha ha written on it on both the communications. He wrote ha ha on this communication and he wrote ha 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 on the Fairfield letter. So there is a little bit of a connection there, but there's also a connection to the proximity of where Doreen Gall lived and the Albany Medical Center. Do you want to add a bit more to that?
Yeah, so she was killed in Los Angeles, but lo and behold, she had come from Albany, New York, 3,000 miles across the country before she was killed. And the home she lived in Albany is, I think, 2 blocks from the medical center.
350 feet.
350 feet. There you go. So we have something in this case we call synchronicity, which is these coincidences that come up in the Zodiac case. And this is either just a huge case of synchronicity or there's something to it and it needs to be looked into. One other thing, you mentioned some good points about that letter to Doreen Gall. It could be a joke, just one of her friends playing a prank on her and it just was in poor taste and somehow she wound up being killed. And it's been connected incorrectly to Zodiac. But I think it would be foolish not to at least look into that possibility. But there's one more thing that is in that letter where he says time is short. And if I'm not mistaken, when Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were talking to Zodiac at Lake Berryessa, I think he used something to the extent of the term time is short or time is running short. An odd phrase, and you might be able to refresh my memory on that. But I think there was something said along those lines by Zodiac to Cecilia and Brian. It's interesting if he did say that.
So it wouldn't surprise me if he was somehow connected to this note.
Yeah, again, in this case, nothing is surprising. And after 50 plus years of the case not being solved, I almost want to go back and re-examine everything that I perhaps brushed off at one point. Because if everything was cut and dry and so black and white, it seems the case would have been solved. So maybe there's something along the way that is a clue that's just being overlooked and might one day solve the case. You know, I still go back to things and find new things that I've missed in the past.
What do you think of the Christmas card sent to Donna Lass's sister in Sioux Falls on December the 27th, 1974, Mike?
Well, it's interesting. It was mailed from Alameda County, which we know Zodiac mailed 1 or 2 letters from. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there were signs that he mailed letters from there. So the fact that the letter came from Alameda County all the way to Sioux Falls is interesting. And I went back to that thing. Could this have been someone that knew Donna and knew where she lived and was from? And that's how they were able to send that card to her sister. Just recently refound multiple articles mentioning Mary Pilker, Donna's sister, being in the Bay Area trying to raise clues about her sister. And it mentioned she's from Sioux Falls. So all someone would have to do is just call Sioux Falls operator and say, yes, please give me the address on file for Mary Pilker. Then they have their address and they can mail her a letter. So I think it could be as simple as that. There's no proof that someone knew Donna's sister and mailed her the letter. But what's interesting, again, is that fact that it was mailed from Alameda County. And I haven't looked at it in a while, and I don't remember if there was multiple stamps on it, but, you know, that alone, the Alameda County connection is interesting. Unfortunately, there's only cursive writing on the envelope and in the card, and we don't really have any confirmed cursive writing from Zodiac. So it's hard to say that that writing could be from Zodiac. We just don't know. I wish that the person had used some printing on it, and that would have helped determine could it be Zodiac, or maybe we could rule them out. The other option is maybe it was a well-meaning person that read the story about Donna and was sad for her family and legitimately wanted to show their respect by mailing a card to them. And maybe that's all there is to it.
Have you had any thoughts on the phraseology on the card, Guardians of the Pines?
When you combine that with the Zodiac's peek through the pines, you get that Pines reference. That seems interest. So you can't dismiss it as being Zodiac related because he's mentioning Pines once again.
Have you dropped down on Donna Pass Road by Clare Tappan Lodge and looked at the imagery and compare it to the 1974 Christmas card?
No, I haven't.
if you drop down and look, because Clare Tapping Lodge is set slightly back from the road, if you drop, you can see Clare Tapping Lodge just through the pines, and the imagery from Google Maps looks exactly like that card.
I'll have to check that out, and hopefully listeners, if they want to see that, they can go find that too I'm sure that's on your site. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac. Or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site, zodiacciphers.com, or by going to Mike's site at zodiackillersite.com.
We'd like to take a moment to thank all the people that have reached out to Rich and I to say congrats on starting Zodiac Speaking, or to compliment us on the podcast or the material we've covered so far. We really appreciate all the support, and if you'd like to help us grow, please take a minute to rate us and leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. You can also recommend Zodiac Speaking to your friends. We'll be doing a special Q&A episode coming up, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to us on social media. Or you can email us questions directly at zodiacspeakingpodcast@gmail.com.